Well, welcome everyone. And this is going to be such a special occasion and a very hearty, warm welcome to Terry Smith, who is not only an extraordinary and versatile journalist, going from print to television to radio with his wonderfully mellifluous voice, but he also has this wonderful worldwide perspective. He's but also actively engaged in local issues. I know he's very concerned about the seas and the environment. He lives up the road from us in Annapolis, where he enjoys sailing the seven seas. An interesting anecdote about Annapolis for a journalist: it's the home of one of the oldest newspapers in the country, dating back to 1727. It even had the very first woman publisher of a newspaper, Anne Catherine Green, in 1767. But a little closer to home, Terry does have a connection to our neighborhood. One of his children was actually born at Columbia Hospital, right here in Foggy Bottom, West End. So Terry, welcome, welcome. We are so looking forward to hearing about your extraordinary adventures and as you've recounted them in your memoir. So welcome, welcome.
Lorna, thank you very much. We have, of course, mutual friends, you and I, and I've spent a fair amount of time in Foggy Bottom covering the State Department for many years, and then in the West End as well. So I know the neighborhood, and I'm happy to join you. Jonas will keep me straight here on the technology. He's already helped, and so I appreciate that. I'm happy to tell you about this book and then have a conversation about anything you like, which you can bring up in questions or comments later. As you can see on the screen the image of the cover?
It looks good.
No, want to go back. There, is that visible on the screen?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Okay, so that's the cover of the book. It came out just a couple of months ago. It is a memoir, 4 Wars, 5 Presidents, a reporter's journey from Jerusalem to Saigon to the White House, which kind of gives you a sense of the parameters of the book. And all I'm going to do today is share some of the stories that are in the book and give you a little flavor of what it's like. The book opens there in Jerusalem, in my opinion, a magical city, quite troubled right now, as I know you must know, in the headlines between Israel and the Palestinians, once again fighting over that very site in the center of the picture. The Dome of the Rock is on what Israelis call the Temple Mount, and what Palestinians call the Noble Sanctuary, that is the Dome of the Rock, and next to it the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a very sacred place actually to 3 religions, and therefore, as life would have it, a constant point of friction. I arrived there as a very young foreign correspondent, 10 days before the 6-Day War, which began on June 5th, 1967. And I had always wanted to be a foreign correspondent. I had worked on papers in New York covering politics, but now I got a chance to go overseas to be the New York Times correspondent in Jerusalem. And I arrived, as I said, just before the war, and I cannot emphasize enough how little I knew, how utterly unprepared I was for what was about to happen. But I guess I was not totally alone. I was staying in that regard. I was staying there in that hotel, the King David Hotel. Some of you may be familiar with it. And I have the picture because it shows you those balconies up on the third floor is where I was. You're looking directly across the former no man's land to the walled old city of Jerusalem, and which in those days was controlled entirely by Jordan. Jordan had the eastern half of the city, and Israel had the western half of the city. And as the war began, I have to be frank, for me, with a phone call from a friend and a hangover. We'd had a party the night before, and I'll tell you why. The day before, June 4th, 1967, the then defense minister, Moshe Dayan, had a news conference in which he said that Israel was going to give diplomacy more time. Well, my advice to you is, whenever you hear a military man say they're going to give diplomacy more time, that you might seriously consider going to the shelters, because certainly he didn't mean it. He's at an afternoon news conference on the 4th, and the war began on the morning of the 5th. And so we geniuses in the foreign press had believed Moshe Dayan, and so we had a party instead of preparing for what was about to come. In any event, the war began, and I covered it. The battle, I covered the quite epic battle for Jerusalem. Others were in the Sinai and the Golan Heights and so forth. And so there I am, this incredibly young picture is me on June 7th, 1967, just as the Israeli troops encircled the eastern half of the city, and the fighting was very substantial. But at this point, the Arab Legion, of Jordan had decided to withdraw, so they had retreated to the east. Those gentlemen crouched down by the rocks there, by the stone wall, were Palestinians from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem. They'd been captured and were told to crouch down and face the wall, and then they were carted off to some sort of prison after that. The Israeli jets came overhead, but interestingly, while they attacked many positions east of Jerusalem and on the eastern side, they did not strike the walled old city, which dated back to the 15th century when it was laid out and built by Suleiman the Magnificent. And so they did not strike that, but they did elsewhere, and basically captured the entire city in a little more than 48 hours. And the fighting was quite intense, as you can see in this image of Israeli troops firing from a position. They're in West Jerusalem, behind that little wall, and just across the way is the wall of the walled old city. And so you get a sense of how close in the fighting was. It took place elsewhere as well. That's the road down to Jericho, where Israeli troops knocked out Jordanian tanks and trucks and armored personnel carriers, and rolled into East Jerusalem. That's Nablus Road in East Jerusalem, and effectively took over. Lots of jubilation among the troops. And this image, a photo by David Rubinger, a wonderful Time magazine photographer, was taken as the Israeli troops got to the base of the Western Wall, the retaining wall of the Second Temple, the holiest site in Judaism, they had not been able to go there in the 19 years since the 1948 war, and suddenly they had it. They were in control. It was, in fact, historically, the first time Jews had been in control of the entire city of Jerusalem in 2,000 years. The city, I looked up in history and found had been fought over and captured and recaptured 44 times in its long history. So it's not exactly new, but you can see in this picture that some of the younger, more observant troops were enormously impressed by the history and impact of the moment. Others danced a hora at the base of the wall. You get a better picture of the wall there. And you see the proximity of everything. Look, there's a mosque and a minaret up to the left and the wall there. So everything is absolutely cheek by jowl. And so that was a story I wrote at the time. Israelis weep and pray beside the Wailing Wall. And some, as is the tradition, prayed and inserted messages into the cracks in the wall. This picture, which went around the world and came to symbolize the Israeli taking of Jerusalem, has a wonderful backstory to it that I'll share with you. It's in the book. These three men striding into the old city through the Lion's Gate on the eastern side of the city. You can see through the gate the Garden of Gethsemane and Mount of Olives behind. These three men from left to right, Uzi Narkis, the commander of the Jerusalem region. In the middle, Moshe Dayan, famous character with his eye patch. And on the right, that's Yitzhak Rabin, later prime minister, but he was then the commander, overall chief of staff of the army. So the three men had arrived about 2 hours later than we did, and stopped outside the old city and outside that Lion's Gate and waited while their press and public relations people organized the photographers and particularly the television cameramen to be in position inside. And then at a signal, the three of them strode in to the old city. So it just shows you that even in the midst of war, PR plays a role. And they did, certainly. And that picture went around the world and came to symbolize the taking of Jerusalem. That's a picture of one of the many souk in the eastern part of the city, one of the many shops there. And I include it just to tell you that suddenly the city was won. Israelis poured in looking for bargains, frankly, on the eastern side. Things were much cheaper in the former Jordanian section than in Israel, which was a teenager of a country. It was 19 years old at that point. So they came in, and it proved that the human instinct for a bargain trumps everything, because they poured into the city, and they got to know each other. Israelis discovered that Palestinians were not all out to get them, and Palestinians discovered Israelis were not 10 feet tall. They were just people, and they got along pretty well. Everybody assumed there would be peace in 3 or 4 months, but of course that is not the case. And today, as I said at the beginning, they're fighting over this very same territory. It's almost an unintended theme in the book 4 wars, 5 presidents, that history repeats itself again and again. That was true certainly in the Middle East and elsewhere, as you'll see and as I share some of these stories. But it's a theme that sort of emerged, just not from me, just from what actually happened. The height of the negotiation over the consequences of the Six-Day War occurred many years later in Camp David. That's Anwar Sadat on the left and Menachem Begin, then the Prime Minister of Israel, on the right, and of course Jimmy Carter in the middle. And they achieved the Camp David Accords that led to peace, formal peace treaties between Israel and both Egypt and Jordan. I have this up here to move on to another story that occurred a year later. That's obviously a poster from Bobby Kennedy's race for the New York Senate in 1964. That's the only campaign he ever finished. And I covered it for the New York Herald Tribune, actually, and was frankly skeptical about Kennedy beforehand, but came to be convinced over the course of the campaign that his concern for civil rights and human rights was genuine. And so I put that in there because I was still in Jerusalem on June 5th, same day, June 5th, 1968, when he was assassinated in Los Angeles at the Ambassador Hotel. After a victory speech, he was shot in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel. And I learned about it in whatever I was, 8,000 miles away, and as shocked as anybody. But I came to be involved in the sense that the next day, the American ambassador to Israel shared with me that the assassin's father, this man, Sirhan Sr., lived in a village just outside of Jerusalem. So I went to his house, that house you see in the lower picture. Immediately, I went there that same night. By the time I got there and found it, it was 10 o'clock at night. It was dark. The house was dark, but I rapped on the door, and the man that you see in the upper right picture came to the door in pajamas. He had gone to bed, obviously. He turned on the lights. I explained who I was and tried to make it clear. And he invited me in, insisted on making coffee. And we sat down at the kitchen table and I interviewed him about his son. But to get it started, I asked him if he had heard on the radio about the assassination of Robert Kennedy. And the answer was yes. He said he'd heard it. He thought it was terrible. He had heard it on the radio that evening. And he believed Kennedy could have been president. So he thought it was terrible. So I said, did you hear that they captured the assassin right on the spot? And he said, yes, he'd heard that too. He'd heard that on the radio, but no further reaction. And so I said to him, did you hear the name of the assassin? And he said, no, I didn't hear that. I went to bed. He hadn't heard that. So I pushed my reporter's notebook across the kitchen table. By now it's 11 o'clock at night. And I said, I understand you have 5 sons. Would you write down their names? And he did. He wrote down the 5 names, and the 4th name was Sirhan Jr. And that's the father, that's the son. And I said, I put my finger on that name and I said, that's the assassin. That's the person they captured on the spot, gun in hand. And he looked at me. He could hardly believe it. He looked at me and he said, first he said, it's not possible. He was the best of the boys, had the best grades. I had the highest hopes for him. And then he would switch. You could see in his eyes. And he said, but if he did it, he should hang. And back and forth he went between those two posts. So I could see this was a pretty unstable man. And I went back to Jerusalem and I wrote the story of the encounter with the father. This is a picture of Sirhan Sirhan Jr. today. 53 years later, he has been in prison all this time in California, was recently declared eligible for parole, but that was blocked by the governor, Gavin Newsom, but he's likely to come up for parole again very shortly. So it was an extraordinary exposure to that whole adventure. I moved on to become the Southeast Asian correspondent based in Bangkok for the New York Times. And as I write in the book, there's suddenly Cambodia, the neighboring country, absolutely wonderful country, became open. That's, you can see Thailand on the to the west there. And it had been closed to the Western press, headed by Prince Norodom Sihanouk, but he opened it up. So we all went in there, and I stayed in the Hotel Royal in Phnom Penh. Quite a wonderful place. The garden in the back, which you see there, it had a lot of tables and they served drinks, and I'll tell you, in the evening, the characters who assembled there, a bunch of spies and crooks and press and some diplomats, other characters, all keeping an eye one on the other, as they did in that garden. But Sihanouk took the press around his country to show it off and had a very good time. And then he introduced us to these characters. 11 US Navy sailors had blundered up the Mekong River from Saigon and gotten themselves captured. And he'd held them for 5 months in an effort to pressure the United States to stop its bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which ran down the eastern side of Cambodia. And finally, he decided to release them. So this was Independence Day, and a big ceremony. And he dressed them in these white suits that you see and ties. And he announced to everybody, I see myself largely balding with the sunglasses in the back there, just behind him. He introduced everybody to these sailors and said he was going to let them go. But before he did, he said he was going to treat them to a special day in Phnom Penh. Well, his Sihanouk, who was by then on his
seem to have lost him. We'll give him just a second to rejoin. Seem to have lost him here. Right in the middle of it. Great story too. Hopefully lost him. Okay, well, hopefully he comes back. Oh, there he is. You're gonna need to re-unmute yourself, Terence.
I am unmuted.
Okay, and you're gonna need to reshare. It seems to have stopped there, fortunately.
Okay, that was, something came up and I clicked on it and that was obviously a mistake. Okay, share screen again.
Yes.
There it is. Click on the PowerPoint.
Yep, and then click share.
And it's back.
Perfect.
Okay,
No
I'll try
momentum lost.
not to mess it up again, Jonas.
No worries. No momentum is lost.
Anyway, I wanted to share with you something Sihanouk told me in an interview I did with him about Vietnam, about the American war in Vietnam. That's an image from Saigon. Because I think it was so profound and absolutely right. And I published it in the New York Times. And I suppose it was read in Washington, the White House, and so forth. But as you will see, it certainly wasn't observed. This is, remember, November of 1968. It's after Tet. The U.S. has a huge number, 500,000 troops in Vietnam, and we're in the thick of the war. And it's already becoming controversial at home, but the war is on and more troops are being sent. And here I'm going to read you two sentences from what Sihanouk said to me in an interview. He said, "You will be forced to take your troops and leave Vietnam. You cannot block the majority will. The majority of the people want to be with Ho Chi Minh, and there is nothing you can do about it. You would be wise to withdraw and let the Vietnamese settle their own problems themselves." And mind you, this is 1968, and we continued that war, and tens of thousands of US soldiers died, and many more Vietnamese, until it finally ended in 1975. So I must say, I published it, and yet nothing changed, and it raised some kind of fundamental questions for me about the value of journalism and the stubbornness of policy. And once down certain roads, people continue down those same roads. Anyway, I moved on to Saigon as the New York Times bureau chief during the war. I was there from 68 to 70. And I want to show you this because that's the presidential palace in the heart of Saigon. Ugly building in my view. And I decided to bring my wife and infant daughter into Saigon, as opposed to other correspondents up to that point had mostly kept their families in Hong Kong or Bangkok. But I thought it was safe, so I rented a house on Winzhou Street, a lovely street that ran alongside this palace, which has a big compound around it, and had security. So I thought that would be good. And it was just down the road from the famous twin spires of the Saigon Cathedral. And so I figured I was going to be safe, right? How could it be wrong? I had the presidential palace across the street. I had the Lord just down the block. And what could go wrong? Well, I found out soon enough. Within a few nights, mortars and rockets landed in the street in front of us. I discovered that the Viet Cong, who would set up across the Saigon River and send their rockets and mortars in at night, would use the twin spires of the Saigon Cathedral and the antenna here that you see above the presidential palace as their Kentucky windage, sort of, to fire in there. Not very smart on my part, but as it turned out, we managed. It was much better than out here in the field, and I did any number of these landings during the course of the next 2 years. That was the second war. The third, and I have to say, I left in June of 1970, and there was 5 more years of war to go. The third war in the title, 4 Wars, 5 Presidents, was the 1973 war between Israel and our Arab neighbors. And I ended up covering that. I had returned to Washington and gone back to Jerusalem as to serve a full term, normally 3 or 4 years, as the correspondent there. And so that occurred, and I covered that war. Here is an image of jubilant Egyptian soldiers coming across a floating bridge they set down in the Suez Canal. And of course, they were jubilant because they were coming from the west to the east into the Sinai Peninsula, which Israel had captured in the 1967 war. The Israeli troops rallied and marched back towards the west, and some very heavy shelling in places like this. That's immediately east of the Suez Canal. That in the middle there, extraordinary photograph. That is an Israeli officer with a pen and paper, and he is taking the names of the Egyptian prisoners in front of him, and a shell has landed just behind them. And somehow my friend and the photographer Micha Baram had the presence of mind to take this picture. I think it's quite extraordinary. But it gives you a very up close sense of what it was like. Of course, the result was that Israel retook the Sinai Peninsula, later gave it away in negotiations, and still had the West Bank that we see today. So once again, the more things change, the less they change. And that's the way it looks, of course, today. The fourth and final war I read about in the book, 4 Wars, 5 Presidents, took place in 1974 in Cyprus, this gorgeous island in the middle of the Mediterranean, when the Turks invaded what was then Greek Cyprus and took the northern section of it. A war that isn't much mentioned, but was every bit as hairy as anything in Vietnam or the Middle East. And that's Nicosia, the capital of Cyprus. If you haven't been there, I recommend it. It is an absolutely gorgeous place. Those are the Kyrenia Mountains in the distance. And the Turkish troops were quite jubilant coming in, and they took over the northern and eastern 40% of the city, of the island, excuse me. And that's what it is today. Once again, what happened is still as it is today. So draw from that what you will. This is just a shot to show you, that's a picture of my father, who was the late Red Smith. He was, in his day, the most widely read sports columnist in the country. And he won a Pulitzer Prize, in fact, in 1976 for commentary, the first time a sports columnist had ever been so honored. And in 1967, that picture on the left, that's the two of us standing over Masada in Israel, in the Negev. And he came he came to visit. But I show that as a way of explaining that for me, a newspaper career was a kind of natural path, and I was following in his footsteps. I came back to Washington and was assigned to the White House, covered it first for the Times, and then assigned again to the White House for CBS News. I moved from print to broadcast in 1985. Look at that old-fashioned microphone and in the picture, and began covering the White House. I was familiar with the story, but now I was doing it in a different medium. And it has, of course, different priorities and imperatives. But I learned a lot, and I think it was truly worth doing. The first of the 5 presidents in the title, 4 Wars, 5 Presidents, the first that I covered his foreign policy, was Richard Nixon. And Nixon, as we all know, was quite a character, and his foreign policy was probably his greatest achievement, and much of it shepherded by that fellow on the right, Henry Kissinger, who's still alive today. I think he's 90, in his mid-90s. They're sitting in the Oval Office, and if you've ever looked at the famous Nixon tapes, which came out after Watergate, you would come across long conversations they would have, I expect, sitting just like this in the Oval Office and talking, and you would be appalled, I think, at how much time they spent talking about their press coverage and stories they liked, stories they mostly didn't like, including some from me. And Nixon was at this point complaining to Kissinger about something I'd written and Kissinger was at great pains to explain that he was not the source for the story, that the story must have come from the State Department. Kissinger was then the National Security Advisor in the White House. So he was trying to persuade Nixon of this. And it shows you a little something about the mercurial nature of Henry Kissinger. Here's something out of the tapes. And Kissinger says to Nixon, first of all, Terence Smith never calls my staff. Well, I'm sorry, that wasn't true. He has never done it in all the years that we've been here. Doubly not true. They were major source. Secondly, my staff is on additional instructions not to return any New York Times calls here. That was true. He had given the order, but it was ignored. And Nixon is just further annoyed. He says, that's right. And Kissinger says, so that's out of the question. There's no way I could have been the source. Well, of course, he was the source of much of the story, he and his staff. Jimmy Carter was the second president. I covered his single term for the New York Times in the White House. And, there was never a more hardworking, diligent, focused president who tried to accomplish a great deal. He was a very intelligent man. He is also alive, of course, today in his mid-90s. And what's interesting about him is that he was one of those personalities who could think through a problem and arrive at a conclusion. And he believed his decision was so right that everybody would understand it right away. He didn't even have to lobby Congress or explain it or campaign for it. So that was, of course, wrong. He did so on the plane. We're on a press plane flying somewhere, and he's trying to make his case. That was then Air Force One, a Boeing 707. Today it's a 747. And we flew around the world on that one, tail number 27,000. And with Carter and Mondale, and then subsequently with Reagan and other presidents. Let me tell you, the press section was not exactly plush. That's it. It was in the back of the bus, believe me. And in the front, the president had a suite with a bedroom and even a shower and a conference room and so forth. But we were back here. I logged a lot of miles in that plane, and some of them with Fritz Mondale on the left there, his vice president. There was one trip that Mondale and I took around all of Southeast Asia, 28,000 miles we traveled. And we ended up here in Wellington, New Zealand. And the reason I bring it up is to give you a little sense of Mondale and what he was like. He was one of the few politicians you could kid and have fun with. And all around Southeast Asia, at every stop, the plane had arrived and there was no crowd. Might be an official reception group, but no crowd. And so we were kidding Mondale, who would come back to the back of the plane from time to time. And we'd say, you know, nobody's paying any attention to you. We don't see any crowds. There's nothing. Well, we got to Wellington, New Zealand, and Mondale, we discover as we get there that there's a huge crowd out on the tarmac waiting for the plane to pull up in Wellington, where Mondale was to interview and exchange talks with this man, the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Muldoon. He was known universally in New Zealand to the Kiwis as Piggy Muldoon. And Mondale was there to have talks with him. So the plane circled around and came up close to the crowd where it was going to stop. And we could see that they were holding up placards. And Mondale comes right back to the back of the plane, points out the window at the crowd and says, you see, I'm big here. I'm really big in Wellington. And so we say, yeah, well, it's a crowd, that's for sure. And we get up close where we can finally read the signs. And it says, Mondale Muldoon, a close encounter of a turd kind. And I realized it was a little sense of the Kiwi humor on Piggy Muldoon and Mondale. Mondale actually loved it. He thought it was funny. But so we went on. We flew back on the plane. God, it was a long flight from Wellington to Hawaii and then to Washington. And I put this up because Mondale opened up all the sections of the plane and showed the film Saturday. I'm blanking now. Not Saturday Night Live. Saturday Night Fever. You remember it? And of course, John Travolta in his white suit dancing to the Bee Gees, Staying Alive. We played that all night and probably had too many gin and tonics watching it. And when it finished, Mondale liked it so much, he said, play it again. And they played the whole damn thing again. But I enjoyed him. We flew on to Hickam Air Force Base where he gave a big speech and home. Mondale died recently, as you probably know. And there is, interestingly, a memorial for him in Minneapolis this Sunday between 1 and 3 p.m. Eastern. And it's available streaming on YouTube. I think there'll be some interesting stories there. This image is probably familiar. It is, of course, the American hostages taken in Tehran in 1979 by, actually November of 78, by radicals in Tehran and held for 444 days. It was, of course, the greatest challenge and probably the effective end of Jimmy Carter's presidency, even though he served on. And the hostages were finally released on this day, January 20th, 1981, when Reagan was sworn in, and you see Carter there on the right. But it completely took over his presidency. So Reagan was the next president I covered, and I covered him at the White House and around the world, including in Geneva, where he sat down for the first of his 4 summit meetings with Mikhail Gorbachev of what was then the Soviet Union. And as you can see, they got along famously in this picture. I covered all 4 of the summits that went on in Reykjavik. Well, first Geneva there, then Reykjavik, Iceland, and then where they met in this guest house just outside of Reykjavik. And then in Washington, where Gorbachev famously got out on Connecticut Avenue and shook hands outside the White House. I mean, that was incredible thing for a Soviet leader to do. And it told you that things were changing. And then finally, the 4th and final summit in Moscow, in Red Square, there in the shadow of St. Basil's by Lenin's tomb, where a reporter asked Reagan, do you still consider the Soviet Union to be the evil empire? And he said, no, that was then, this is now, things have changed. So it was the effective end of the Cold War, but here we are today in a new or maybe continuing Cold War. Somebody said to me the other day, we're actually in 2 Cold Wars. One with Russia today, and one with China. And we're in a post-Western world. Interesting concepts that certainly caught my eye. I covered Clinton, again, brilliant, got a lot done, did a lot, served 2 terms, but of course, ruined his own record by what came next. This is a great moment. I share this with you. This is Clinton on the south side of the White House, where he brought Yitzhak Rabin on the left and Yasser Arafat on the right together and got them to shake hands in front of a huge crowd as a symbol of rapprochement, which is far from complete. And there's a backstory that I'll share with you. Just before they came out of the White House for this scene, Clinton got the 2 of them together and explained he was going to ask them, former enemies, to shake hands out in front of the crowd. And Arafat said, no problem. Rabin hesitated. Well, he said, okay, he'd shake hands. But then he pointed at Arafat and said to him, no kissing. And indeed, Arafat held back. But this, of course, famous moment when he said, I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. But of course he had. And he was ultimately impeached for perjury and yet reelected to a second term and served out. But it has it obviously tarnished his reputation. The final president that I covered was George W. Bush. This is him in Des Moines, Iowa, or outside, in a barn, declaring for president. And he's going to run. And I was there with a camera crew for CBS, watching in the back of the crowd. And I looked at George W. Bush, an immensely decent man, wonderful wife, Laura. I thought a considerate, decent individual who had, quite frankly, no idea what he was going to do with the presidency. I don't think he had any idea why he was running, except his name was Bush. And he could run, and he won, as we all know. In many respects, I think he was trying to maybe compete with his father, H.W. And it was an interesting relationship. And I think he felt he bested his father by being reelected and serving 2 terms, when his father, George H.W. Bush, had only served 1 and was defeated. So that gives you just a sense of what's in the book. And it's available on Amazon or at Politics and Prose or anywhere you like. There's a great deal in it about this place, the White House. I worked there for many years, and I have to tell you, was always impressed by it. So, Lorna, we've saved a little time for questions.
Oh, that's
If
great.
you have them, or anybody else has them, come ahead.
Well, if I could start off, I'm curious, of all the stories that you and places you were, what was your favorite story? Do you have one?
Yeah, I do. But favorite is, I have a little trouble with that word.
Okay.
I mean, obviously the 6-Day War made the biggest impression on me. I was, and my total of 5 years in Israel and covering that conflict, which of course continues to this day. So I would say that was the most, had the greatest impact on me. I'm not sure what was favorite or not favorite.
Is it because it was the first one? Is that why you think?
Well, surely that's part of the story, part of the explanation, wouldn't you think? And it had an enormous impact on me. I've been back many times. The Israel today is unrecognizable from the Israel I covered in the 70s and 80s. It's hardly, I mean, the attitudes have changed. The politics have certainly changed. The country has swung way to the right. And yet the situation remains troubled. The other favorite, if you want to use that word, was the presidents and the White House. Not one story, but the experience. Mm-hmm. Memorable.
Thank you. And I think someone else has a question.
Yeah, there was one in the chat. Do you think the second Bush ever figured out what to do when he was president?
I don't think either. Well, no, is the honest answer. I mean, it's, I respect him. And as I said, I think he was W, enormously decent person, as was his father, H.W. Bush, whose presidency I did not cover. I knew him, but I did not cover his presidency. I was overseas. But you know, you remember when George H.W. Bush effectively won the war against Saddam Hussein and rolled him back out of Kuwait. His poll numbers were through the roof. I don't know, 90%. And then it turned and the poll numbers went way down as he tried to figure out what to do with the rest of his presidency. We had a sluggish economy and very little policy. And harsh as it is to say, I'm not sure he had what, remember there was an argument about, did he have the vision to be president? And they called it the vision thing. What about the vision thing? Well, I think he was a little short in that department of what to do with it, despite the fact that he'd been vice president for 8 years before that, HW had, and head of the CIA, ambassador to China. I mean, he had the most amazing resume, and yet couldn't get reelected and couldn't persuade the public that he was the man to lead the country.
Thank you. That's a great answer. We do have a time for a couple more questions. If you'd like to unmute yourself or to put them in the chat.
I do, sure. What do you want me to do now?
No, just saying for the crowd, if anyone has, we have a couple more minutes for questions.
Take 4 minutes.
So if you'd like to unmute yourself, oh, there's two that just came up in the chat.
Okay.
Any reflections on differences in journalism today, for better or for worse?
Yes, and in fact, I go into this in the book. I try to explain at each stage in the process what a different world it is today from what I experienced covering these various events, these 4 wars, these 5 presidents. Today, both because of technology and social media, the internet, it is hugely different. For example, in covering the any of it, the 6-Day War, everything I could gather in the course of a day of reporting would go into a single story that will go into the next day's New York Times. Instead, today, if I was watching the battle for Jerusalem, I would, tweet about it. I would take images of it. I would post videos. I would probably get calls from NPR and others to talk about it. I mean, the transmission is so immediate today. It's a different world. It's just a completely different world. I like to think the principles of journalism remain the same, but the technology of it has changed the rhythm, the pacing, the delivery. I mean, look at New York. Look at the New York Times, my old newspaper. I worked there for 20 years. It was, I think, at the height in those days, the Sunday edition maybe sold 1.7 or 8 million copies, and the daily 1.1. Today, the New York Times has 10 million subscribers, almost all of them digital. The print paper, which goes to ancients like me, although there may be, I wonder, there's no way to poll the audience, I suppose, how many people still get newspapers on print delivered to their doorstep? Yeah, I mean, but I'm afraid we are a minority, an increasing minority. I still do. I get 3 newspapers a day, 21 a week on my doorstep. It's a menace. I get the New York Times, I get the Washington Post, and I get the Annapolis Capital. And so the change in journalism, also the blending and, if you like, blurring of the lines between opinion and fact and journalism has been greatly accelerated by I think the major impact is cable television, with Fox on the right and and MSNBC on the left, CNN somewhere in the middle, and just polemics, at least at night, on all these channels. So that has greatly increased, in my experience, the partisan quality of our public discussion and our journalism today. It's just a fact. I think you can still find the straight story, but the burden of determining what's true and what's not is now up to you. The newspaper editor used to be your gatekeeper. Now you're your own gatekeeper. You have to decide. You read something on social media, it seems crazy. Well, if it seems crazy, it probably is. I think common sense is the greatest tool, but you have to decide for yourself. Nobody's going to tell you. I mean, I remember the period when the conspiracy theorists had, what was it, that Hillary Clinton was leading a pedophile circle that was abusing children in the basement of the Comet Pizza place on Connecticut Avenue. Yeah, well, first of all, Comet Pizza doesn't have a basement, and it was all nonsense, and yet it spread on social media. Well, I think a reasonable person who comes across that, if you don't mind the phrase, knows bullshit when he or she sees it. And that was bullshit. And so much of today, so that burden now falls on the reader, or the viewer, or the listener.
Thank you very much. I saw someone unmuted for a second there. So if anyone else in the audience has a question, definitely feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. I think Carol there.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can see
Yeah,
this.
I'm Carol's husband.
You're
I'm
not Carol.
I'm Lou Simons. Terry and I, without knowing it at the time, overlapped in Saigon back in 67, 68. Anyway, I'd like Terry to, if you would, address yourself to, do you think that it is the news media that are contributing to the divide in the American body politic, or vice versa?
Oh, well, no, of course they are, Lou. Of course they are. This polarization that I'm talking about on cable or on social media is injecting energy into the divide in our country and accentuating it. There's no question about that. I'm not saying it should, we should cancel the First Amendment or anything like that. I'm just saying that the division we see now, which seems so total on everything, I mean, whether we wear masks or, get vaccinated, or everything is, or down Governor DeSantis in Florida against Disney. I mean, everything now is divisive. Everything is polarized. And, there are times, I have to say, when I think we don't have enough to do or something, because some of the arguments are so superficial and empty and pointless. I think if we had I don't know, maybe if we had more problems on our hands, we wouldn't do that, but I'm not wishing it on us, of course. Anyway, if anybody else has a question, that's fine. Otherwise, I'm sure you've had enough of all this.
I do want to say just thank you very much. I really enjoyed that, and especially with the pictures in the background. I thought it was a really fascinating journey through your career, and I encourage people to go out and track down the book at the library or Politics and Prose or at Amazon if you need, or wherever
Yeah,
you
you
get
can
your books.
order it. You can order it. The publisher is Roman and Littlefield. You can order directly from them. Their headquarters, incidentally, is in Lanham, Maryland. Of course, Politics and Prose, or very simply on Amazon.
It's a wonderfully written adventure story. It's like you're this young man, you're just going off into it. It's gripping.
Well, thank you, Lorna. That's very kind of you.
So thank you for writing it and for taking the time to share all of your insights and wisdom with us. And much joy to you. Fair weathers for your sailing.
Yes, it's very chilly today, but and brisk, very windy. But beginning today, in fact, there is the spring boat show in Annapolis. So big crowds come and fill the city through Sunday.